I'm going to go ahead with the meeting beginning ritual now. 起立，面向佛堂，参加先鞠躬，一鞠躬，再鞠躬，三鞠躬，参加各位的传世一鞠躬，开班一鞠躬，请坐下。Please be seated.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you again this morning. My topic today is the Tao of Spiritual Connections, a Native American. And you might wonder, well, wow, this is a Tao meeting. Why are we going to talk about a Native American perspective? Well, the reason for that is that in Iguan Tao there is this idea of the 5 religions. And this is right out of the glossary of the Iguan Tao disciplines and rituals. 5 religions are often misunderstood as Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Christianity, and Islam. In actuality, 5 in this context means multiple rather than a literal count of 5. Thus, 5 religions point to the most significant traditions of the world that uplift and inspire people. And I got to be honest, I struggled with this idea of having respect for other religions for a long time. But I finally got over the hump and realized that it's always better to focus on the similarities rather than the differences. And what I found, there are a lot of similarities, particularly in the Native American spiritual practice. So I wanted to share those similarities with you, and I hope they resonate with you as they do for me. So I want to start by talking about sacred places. All religions, of course, have sacred places. For Christians, they go to churches. For Muslims, they go to mosques, Jews, synagogues, Buddhists and Tao cultivators, temples. But for Native Americans, what they do is they have sweat lodges. That's their sacred place. And in the next slide here, I have a diagram of a sweat lodge. And it's usually made of some kind of natural material. It's usually dome-shaped. It varies depending on what's available in the environment. There's typically always a fire, and you'll notice there's a shovel off there to the side of the fire. And then there's a path between the fire and the sweat lodge, and that represents a spiritual path. So when you enter a sweat lodge, you never cross the spiritual path. You always enter from the rear and the sides. The only person who really crosses the spiritual path is the firekeeper, and it's his job to heat the stones and put them inside, and then the practitioner of the ritual will pour water to create steam. So it's like a sauna or a steam bath. But the Native American cultures, they gather in there, and that's where they can meditate, where they can chant, where they can offer up prayers of gratitude, and various other religious practices that go on. It's really quite beautiful. I once had the privilege of going inside one and was able to meditate quite well, actually. And I'm not the most skilled meditator, but I noticed being around those other people and sharing that energy of people together in a circle, focusing on a spiritual practice, really helped me connect better than I would say when I'm on my own. It's funny how contagious spirituality can be. The other thing I love about the Native American practice of the sweat lodges, they heat up the stones, and the stones represent the oldest ancestors. The idea being that when the earth was formed, the stones were among the first things formed, and so they heat them up, and it's built in that it's a respect for the ancestors and for those who have come before, which is a component of Iguan Tao as well. We always have respect for the teachers and masters that have come before. So it's very similar in that respect. But also, mainly what I want to talk about today in terms of Native American spirituality is totems, and I'm just going to start with the definition. A totem is a natural object or animal believed by a particular society to have spiritual significance and adopted by it as an emblem. And here on the left I have an eagle totem, and what strikes me about this eagle totem is it's very difficult to tell where the Native American begins, where the Native American ends, where the eagle begins, where the eagle ends. And to me, that's a great way to communicate the idea of oneness, the idea that we're all connected. We're connected to the earth, we're connected to the other animals, we're connected to the plants, and of course, most importantly, we're connected to each other. It may not seem like we're connected as you go through life and you do the things that we all do in life, it feels kind of like our consciousnesses are closed off from each other, that we really only experience each other's consciousness through symptoms of the body, moving the mouth and speaking and so forth. But really, I tend to think that that's an illusion, that really we are connected. And when you start paying attention to the idea of interconnectivity, it's amazing the things you notice. And I'm going to talk about some of those things today, particularly with regard to totems. The other thing I wanted to say about the eagle totem is the eagle totem is a very powerful totem in most native cultures. In fact, it's actually illegal in the United States to possess eagle feathers unless you're a Native American. And they consider eagle feathers very sacred. And I had a Navajo friend who, he was a coworker and a friend, and he explained to me why the eagle is so sacred. And one of the reasons is because the eagles actually can fly above storm systems. Yet at the same time, they can descend to the lower plane. And if they didn't do that, we wouldn't be aware of them. So they're very omnipresent. And also to a native culture, because they do fly so high, they're believed to be the animal that's closest to the creator. It reminds me a little bit of the ping bird. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with the ping bird. Derek has written 2 wonderful stories about it. I'm not going to talk about these stories specifically, but I just wanted to point them out to you. One is the giant ping bird, and that appears in Derek's book, The Tao of Daily Life, which of course is a wonderful book. It was the first book that he wrote that had the stories in it, just absolutely fabulous. And the second story is called The Flight of the Ping Bird, and that appears in his most recent book, The Tao of Happiness. I'm sure many of you have probably already read these, but if you haven't, I encourage you to get them and to read them. And if you have read them, I also encourage you to give a review on Amazon if you can, because that really helps the book sell. And the more the book sells, it means the more people are getting exposed to these teachings and these stories, and that just makes it, the more people that have this spiritual writtenness, the better it is for us all. So anyways, back to totems. So I can't really talk about totems without talking about my daughter, Natalie. And when Natalie first came to live with my first wife and I, or my first wife and me, she was all of 9 years old, and her sister was, I believe, about 11 or 12. And Natalie and her sister both are Sioux Indians. And when the kids were young, we would often take them camping at my wife's Indian reservation. My wife was my ex-wife is a Luiseño Indian. And so we would go up to La Jolla where her reservation was, and we would camp out sometimes. I think we did it a couple of times. And one time, Natalie was playing with some twigs during a camp out, and I nicknamed her, I teased her and said I was going to give her an Indian name, and I called her Little Twig'em. And so we used to joke about that. But several years later, when she was like, I think 16 or 17, she came to me and she said that she was going to participate in an Indian naming ceremony. And I couldn't help but tease her. I said, really, Natalie? Why do you need an Indian name? You already have one, aren't you, Little Twig'em? But she assured me that she'd still always be my Little Twig'em, but that she would participate in this. And it's really quite interesting. The person who the name is going to be bestowed upon does not know what the name is going to be until the practitioner of the ritual picks the name and announces it during the ritual. And her Indian name turned out to be Shante Washte Wiha, and that's Lakota. And I double-checked with that to make sure I have this right, because it's been a while since I remember the translation. But it means kind-hearted woman. And when I first heard that, I thought, exactly right. That fits Natalie absolutely perfectly. Natalie is now, of course, a grown woman. She has 2 beautiful children and another one on the way. So I'm so proud of the great mother she is. But as Natalie was growing up, she had a totem. And I don't know if she picked the totem or the totem picked her, but her totem was and is the turtle. And I asked her about it, I think when she was maybe 10 or 11. I go, Natalie, why the totem? Why the turtle as a totem? And she told me that when she sees a turtle, it reminds her to slow down, to reconnect, and to let things unfold naturally. And I remember thinking, wow, that's a pretty deep spiritual insight. It makes perfect sense that she would have such a deep spiritual insight at such a young age, because Natalie had a very difficult childhood. There was a lot of death and suffering in hers, and it makes sense that she would have such a deep understanding even at a young age, because suffering is ultimately kind of what makes us grow. We may not like it, but it is actually good for us in terms of spiritual growth. Okay, so I also want to tell you guys a little bit about my totem. Even though I'm not Native American, I'm half Irish and half Pakistani. I was raised Irish Catholic, but I somehow have always identified with the sparrow, and that might be because of the Catholic story of the returning of the sparrows to San Juan Capistrano. I'm not sure if that's the reason, but I've always felt a connection to sparrows. And of course, I can't talk about my connection to sparrows without talking about my first son. And there's a picture of my first son. That he was a junior. He was Alexander Oliver Doyle Farouqi. And he died when he was 5 months old of a congenital heart defect. And what strikes me about this picture as I look at it is how young we both were. Obviously, Alex Jr. was pretty young. He was an infant. But I was only 23 when this picture was taken. And what I find so interesting is had Alex have lived, he would today be the age, he would be 23. He would be the age that I was in this picture. And so I'm going to tell you a little story about sparrows and Alex. And you might say, well, which Alex? And I guess the answer to that is, well, both. This ultimately is a story about sparrows and about birth and about death, which are, of course, are natural cycles of life, leaving and returning. So when my first wife was pregnant of Alex, when we found out, we were overjoyed. We had so much hope for the future. It was just a wonderful time. And we went up to MacArthur Park in San Pedro where we lived, and we had a little picnic. And I remember we sat under a tree, and I could hear the sparrows chirping. And I told my wife of a story that I was aware of, and that was that it's believed that when a woman is pregnant and the soul comes down from heaven, that sparrows can see it, and that's why they sing. So I of course told this to my wife, and she liked the idea, and we reveled in it, and it was a time of such hope and joy. And as things went on, his heart defect was identified rather early, and as a result, they took him via C-section very early. I think it was about 28 weeks, about 10 weeks ahead of a normal termed pregnancy. And despite his heart issues, which his heart really only operated at about 20% of what a normal child's heart would operate at, he actually did quite well for the most part. When he was born, he was 4 pounds. When he died, he was about 5 pounds. So he didn't grow much. And medically, they call that failure to thrive, and that was largely due to his heart condition. And it was decided, at 5 months that he wasn't really gaining weight very well and so forth. So the doctors felt that it was time to intervene. And what they were going to do is they were going to put in a pacemaker, see if they could get his heart rate up, because he had a slow heart rate, and see if that would fix the problem. So that was the hope, that that he could get this pacemaker and possibly live a normal, healthy life. And that, of course, wasn't meant to be. And this is kind of where the sparrows come back into the story. A couple of weeks before his surgery, my wife and I were at a laundromat. And those of you who have children or have had children know that when you have children, what you do a lot of is laundry. And the laundromat was a good place to do it because you could wash, many loads at once and dry them at once, and it saved a great deal of time. So we were almost done, and I was holding Alex in the front, in front of a glass wall, and my wife was folding the clothes. And suddenly a sparrow flew into the laundromat and sort of got fluttered around. It was a little bit startling. And then he sort of tried to fly out, and he darted for the glass wall, right, and he hit it right above where I was sitting holding Alex, and he fell dead right in front of me. Now, at that moment, I intuitively knew that my son wasn't going to survive. I never vocalized it. I never talked about it. But in my heart of hearts, I just knew that that was the case. I can't explain why. It was something I just knew intuitively. And so like I said, I put that out of my head. I didn't vocalize that in any way. But when the time came for his surgery, he had checked in the hospital a few days before, and my wife and I got up early that day so we could get there early and see him before he went into surgery. And I'll never forget the sound as they carted him off to surgery of his heart beating, because they had it on the monitors and you could hear it beating. And as they rolled him down the hallway, the heartbeat slowly sort of just tapered off and fainted away. And so we went up to the waiting room and we waited, and it was an hour or two. One of his doctors came up and told us that the surgery had actually gone quite well, and that for the first time in his life, his heart was beating at a normal rate. And I felt such relief. We felt such relief. We thought, oh, wow, that's great. Yeah. And so at this point, my wife and her other family members that were there were getting hungry. So they went down to the cafeteria. And while they were away, I noticed that there was a code blue call to the neonatal intensive care unit, which is where infants are brought to recover. They don't go to a normal surgical recovery. And I'd heard codes before. We'd been at the hospital many, many times. And I didn't think anything of it really until I looked up and saw a few minutes later one of the nurses that we knew was in the doorway, and she motioned for me to come over. And I came over and I said, what's wrong? And she told me that he had coded that when he came out of the anesthetic, he had gone into arrest, and that I should find my wife and come to the unit. So I went downstairs, and as I was going downstairs and heading toward the cafeteria, she was actually coming out, and our eyes locked. I remember her telling me that she knew from my eyes that there was something wrong. And so we went up, and when we got into the unit, when you first go in, there's a place where you thoroughly have to wash your hands. When we walked in, we saw his bed, and of course he was surrounded by medical personnel and doctors, and we'd seen that before in the neonatal intensive care unit, but never with him. So that was a first. And the nurses escorted us to an adjacent room, and we sat and we waited. And one of his other doctors came in, and she told us that he had gone into full arrest, and that they were trying to resuscitate him, and that they would continue trying as long as they felt that they could continue to get oxygen to his brain. So that went on for a few minutes, but she came back after a few minutes, and I don't remember what she said. I'm sure she gave the normal speech that a doctor gives when someone dies, but what I remember is her just shaking her head, and I realized that it was over, that they weren't able to resuscitate him. And my wife asked to hold him, and so they brought him into her, and she held him. And he was still warm when we held him. And then he grew cold, and so she asked them to take him away at that point. And so we left. And of course, this was by far the saddest moment of my life. I had experience with loss. I lost my parents at a fairly young age. But there was nothing that those other losses just dwarfed this one. It was just so, it was so raw. And I remember when we left to go home, the first thing I noticed was, as we walked into the hospital, I could hear the rustle and bustle of the hospital. I mean, of course, I'd been to the hospital many times, but I was suddenly keenly aware of everything. And I think that's because I was just empty inside, completely empty. And I could feel the emptiness physically, and it just made me more aware. But, as sad as that was, it was an important thing for me to go through. I had to go through that. To become the person that I became, I had to go through that loss. And so I don't look at it with any regret. What I look at it as, I am grateful for the 5 months I got to be a father for the first time, by the way. How wonderful it was. And that's what I focus on and remember. And the sparrows kind of come back into the story a little bit, because I live in the Inland Empire where it's fairly warm. So what I like to do is I like to get up fairly early, usually at 3 or 4 in the morning. And I take a walk. It's nice and cool in the morning, and it's dark out and quiet. But as I walk, the sun comes up, so I almost always see the sunrise. And as the sun rises, I can hear the sparrows chirping, and I can also see them flying around as the light comes out. And of course, it reminds me of my son, and in a good way. I remember the good moments which were, those 5 months were just wonderful. And so I remember that, and I feel a spiritual connection. And a lot of that is because of my totem, the sparrow. It connects me to that, the whole process of birth and death, the cyclical nature of that. As Bill often says, it's about leaving and returning. My son left me that day, but of course he returned to the Tao. And of course he'll always be a part of me. He'll always be a part of my memories. And so that of course is just a good thing. Okay, so I'm just going to start to sum it up here. And just basically talk about totems a bit here. Oops, sorry about that. There we go. So totems can help you make a connection with nature, the way they do with Natalie and with me. Sparrows for me and turtles for Natalie, they help us make that connection with nature. And totems can illuminate a path that will lead to your spiritual growth. For Natalie, that's the Native American path. For me, it's Iguan Tao, Taoism. But there's a lot of similarities. And totems can help you make spiritual connections, of course. And totems will often manifest in your life, but you have to choose to notice them. So in that way, in short, totems are very much like the Tao. The Tao is always there before us. The path is always illuminated. Whether or not we want to align with it and follow it is up to us. But we always have that choice. And I can tell you it enriches my life. It helps me get through the difficult times. And it just makes life worth living. And so thank you very much for listening to me this morning. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I hope something I said was of use, and I hope you all have a wonderful Sunday.
Alex, thank you so much. Definitely, your story is so incredibly moving and touching. I think it is only when we confront death, there's something about it. The touch of death forces us to understand life better. The realization that the mortality is finite and inevitable forces us to evaluate the present, and while we still have this gift of life, that we should cherish every moment that we have with one another. And also another thought that occurred to me is that in our Tao meetings, we haven't talked about Native American spirituality too much. We should probably do that more. I know many people who connect to the Tao meeting have a personal connection with that, and I've spoken in the past about this ancient connection between Native American spirituality and Tao spirituality. DNA evidence proves that Native Americans originate in the continent of Asia. So there was some sort of migration hypothetically through the Bering Strait, perhaps when there was a land bridge connecting North America and Asia, perhaps by sailing. So one theory that I read marked it at 15,000 years ago, and I found myself thinking that however long the actual migration was, some of the basic tenets of the Tao, the respect for nature, the sanctity of nature, it's got to go back at least that far, so that when the migrants from Asia arrived in North America, that's one of the beliefs that they took with them, which is what we have today. So if that is the case, then the Tao goes back, not 2,500 years to the time of Lao Tzu, not 4,800 years to the time of I Ching, but much, much further back, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, back when it was nothing but oral tradition from one generation to the next. Finally, about the 5 religions. I am working my way through a BBC documentary now on the Silk Road, and fascinating insights on how the ancient Chinese establish contact with the Western world. So it is not a great surprise that because the only exposure the ancient Chinese had with Europe was through the Silk Road into ancient Persia, eventually to the merchants of Venice, that they knew, the ancient Chinese knew about Christianity and knew about Islam, but not Judaism or Hinduism. So when they formulated the 5 religions, it was with that particular ignorance in mind. Now, times have changed. So we know more about the world. We're much more, what we know about the different religious paths of the world far surpass that of the ancient Chinese, and therefore it would definitely be a mistake to narrowly define the 5 religions to just what the ancient Chinese knew. So thank you for bringing that up. That is so cool. That is just great. Feedback for you, Alex, from the internet, from Tim. Alex, very touching presentation. Your strength is inspiring. And Tim, that's absolutely correct. I know Alex, and in person, the same, you can feel that same strength emanating from him. That's a very accurate observation. So, Alex, thank you once again for another great presentation. Let's go ahead and do the meeting ending ritual, everybody. 起立，面向佛堂。持架3鞠躬，1鞠躬，再鞠躬，3鞠躬，持架规则是1鞠躬，接班1鞠躬。Okay, everybody, we are done.
Participate in the Tao meeting by joining us online. For information, go to taoism.net/Tao